Boltzmann as a dinner party guest. At the table I sat on Mrs. Hurst's right, as I was the only European present. The first course was blackberries. I declined them. Then followed a melon, which my hostess had most appetizingly salted for me with her own hands. I declined again. Then came oatmeal, an indescribable paste on which people might fatten geese in Vienna. Then again, perhaps not, since I doubt whether Viennese geese would be willing to eat it. I had already noticed the displeased look of the hostess when I refused the melon. Therefore I retched with my head turned away, and thank God I was not actually sick. For those of us with a tendency to think like Boltzmann. Boltzmann was a 19th century victim of a 21st century disease. Anxiety is often irrational, and there lies its most maddening feature. It turns otherwise rational people into lesser versions of themselves. Boltzmann was a rational man prior to his illness. Actually, he was more than rational. He exemplified the power of human reason. But anxiety has a way of crowding out higher, more productive functions. It expands across the space that's provided to it, often leaving little room for anything else. And so the brain that gave us S equals K log W was recommissioned for useless other purposes that hurt its proprietor and hindered a great intellect. He was a happy and successful young man, had a doctoral degree by the age of 22, just 3 years after enrolling as an undergraduate, a position as chair in mathematical physics at the age of 25, a doting wife, and a home that was filled with all the things he loved: food and drink, a piano, and his children. Boltzmann's students wrote of him, "The unpretentious great man made himself available to all hours on end, always equipped with unending patience and delightful humour. He never played up his superiority. Everyone was at liberty to ask questions and even to criticise him. One could converse with him in an uninhibited way as if between equals. He did not measure others with the yardstick of his own greatness." In his memoir, Boltzmann wrote, "Now I must confess that I always suffer a little from stage fright before the first lecture, which of course makes very little sense. Boltzmann was a celebrated scientist who had no reason to fear the lecture hall." The problem described here is a social anxiety that seems to have followed Boltzmann around and may have even chased him to his grave. It was not until middle age that Boltzmann first faltered. When he was 44 years old, he was offered a highly prestigious position at the University of Berlin. If he were to accept this place in Berlin, he would need to defend his work in a much more highly charged arena. Berlin would present him with personal challenges from which he had previously been spared. But he was not built for Berlin, which was clear when he visited the German capital to negotiate the terms of his contract. Boltzmann had managed to avoid failure for the first 44 years of his life. But when he discovered failure, he failed fantastically. Failure introduced him to self-doubt, which was now to be his constant companion. The central issue in the case of Mach versus Boltzmann was atomic theory. The problem is that the particles are too small to be seen. And it's that part, the too small to be seen, that provoked the controversy. For Boltzmann, whose eyes were much weaker than his intellect, it must have seemed self-evident that Mother Nature would prove to be more subtle than his senses could discern. How should we account for things that are not directly observed but only suggested? Mach's response was simple: we do not account for such things, and we should not. His approach was disciplined and it was austere. Establish a set of rules that explain observable phenomena and stop there. It was an intellectually impoverished view of science that denied scientists the opportunity to answer the one question that motivates them most: why? But it was philosophically pure and almost beyond reproach. What good is progress, Mach would argue, if it relies on fantasy? It was late afternoon, approaching early evening on September the 5th of that year. He had travelled to a coastal village with his wife and 3 daughters. Family, friends and colleagues all knew that he was ill. His eyes no longer worked, he had asthma, he suffered chest pains and headaches and enjoyed no peace of mind. He was a wreck. He had moved from one university to the next, with occasional stops at a sanatorium, and was diagnosed with neurasthenia, a disorder long since forgotten, but one that included symptoms of anxiety and depression. Officials at the University of Vienna thought it unlikely that he would be able to continue his teaching duties, so a younger professor was told that he should prepare to teach physics the following year. Yet everyone still hoped for a recovery.